Charleston, South Carolina, 1983. The summer air was thick with magnolia and memory, and the city, lined with pastel-colored houses and cobblestone streets, moved slowly in the heat, as if reluctant to let go of the past. Teresa, 54 years old, a high school English teacher and widow, at least that's what everyone believed, stood at the threshold of another sleepless night. She pulled the sheer curtains closed, lit the small lamp on her nightstand, and reached, as she had done for over a decade, for the letter. It was yellowed now, soft at the corners from years of being unfolded and smoothed, folded and smoothed again. Michael had written it in April of 1972 aboard a Navy vessel deployed to the South Atlantic. His words were tender, hopeful, careful. He had spoken of their daughter, Clara, barely 3 at the time, and promised a swift return. "I'll be home before you miss me," he wrote in neat, measured script. He never came home. The ship vanished after a classified mission no one really talked about. The Navy declared the crew missing, presumed dead. No remains were ever found. Teresa held the letter like a relic, a lifeline, a quiet rebellion against forgetting. She read it aloud every night, in the same voice she once used to soothe Clara to sleep. Her husband's voice became her own, his last words, her prayer. Now, on the eve of Clara's wedding, the house was alive with flowers, family, and the buzz of a new beginning. Teresa had hung the white dress in the living room window to let the light catch its lace. The dining table was set with the good china, and lemon cake cooled on the counter. She had done it all, every detail, alone. And yet, as the sun dipped behind the marshes and the first fireflies began to stir, Teresa felt a different kind of stillness. She placed the letter gently back into the wooden jewelry box that held Michael's service medal, their wedding photo, and a crayon drawing Clara had made of her father, a faceless man in a blue uniform with long arms and no eyes. She sat at the edge of her bed, smoothed her skirt, and closed her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. "It has to be." But fate does not always listen to whispered prayers. And that night, as she finally allowed herself to say goodbye, something long buried stirred again, like a tide turning in the dark. If this story touched you the way it touched me while writing it, please leave a like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing true stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. The reception was held beneath the broad beams of a historic Charleston plantation house, where the scent of jasmine drifted in from the garden and fireflies blinked lazily in the dusky air. Inside, the soft hum of conversation mingled with the music of a string quartet, and the flickering candlelight danced on crystal glasses and linen napkins tied with sage green ribbon, the exact shade Clara had chosen to match her bouquet of eucalyptus and white peonies. Teresa sat at the head table, hands folded tightly in her lap, watching her daughter twirl across the polished hardwood floor in the arms of her new husband. Clara's wedding dress shimmered in the low light, delicate lace trailing behind her like a second skin, and her laughter, unrestrained and clear, rang out like wind chimes on a coastal porch, drawing tears from older relatives and knowing smiles from friends who had watched her grow up. But Teresa's gaze, though steady, was distant, anchored not in the joy of the present, but in the quiet gravity of memory, pulled backward by the weight of absence and the rhythm of a letter she knew by heart. She had folded that letter again that morning, as she had done countless times, running her thumb along the faded crease, imagining the hands that once held the pen, the lips that had spoken the words aloud before ink sealed them into permanence. She had told no one that she'd slept poorly the night before, not from nerves or age or sorrow, but from a strange sensation in her chest, like a door unlatched, swinging in the wind. She had chalked it up to fatigue, or perhaps the sentimentality of seeing her only child married. But now, as music and memory collided, Teresa felt the air shift. The large oak doors at the far end of the hall creaked open. At first, no one noticed. The quartet continued to play, the guests continued to toast. Clara spun again beneath the twinkling string lights. But Teresa, from where she sat, had a direct line of sight to the entry, and the moment her eyes met the man standing in the doorway, the world inside her went silent. He was older, of course, thinner, grayer, a bit stooped at the shoulders, but the eyes were unmistakable, sharp, blue, deeply tired and somehow familiar, like a song you hadn't heard in years, yet still remembered the lyrics to. He wore no uniform, only a well-worn blazer and trousers a little too loose, as if borrowed in haste or never meant to fit. He didn't move. He simply stood there, scanning the room, and then his gaze settled on Teresa. She didn't breathe. The breath left her body not as a gasp, but as a silent surrender, as if her ribs had given up the burden they'd been carrying for over a decade, and her hands, still curled around the bouquet she hadn't yet placed on the table, went limp. The flowers dropped, unnoticed, to the floor. Michael. She tried to stand, to speak, to understand what her eyes were telling her, but the weight of disbelief was too great, and her legs gave out gently beneath her, folding her into the chair like paper. Someone shouted for water. A waiter dropped a tray. The music stopped. Clara, still holding her husband's hand, turned instinctively toward the disruption. When she saw the man at the door, she froze, not with fear, but with a confusion so pure it rendered her still, as if her body refused to move until her mind had caught up. She looked at Teresa. Teresa nodded, slowly, tears beginning to fall, though she hadn't realized she was crying. Clara turned back. Their eyes met, and something ancient passed between them. Not memory, not recognition, but the kind of deep cellular knowing that bridges generations and lives and oceans. "Dad?" she said, not loud, not sharp, just true. It was the first time she had ever spoken that word to the man it belonged to. Michael's lips parted, but no sound came. The room stood still. The past had entered through the front door in flesh and bone, wearing scars and silence, and no one knew what to do. A few relatives recognized him immediately. One uncle whispered, "My God." An old friend from Michael's Navy days dropped his glass. Others looked between Teresa and Clara and back to Michael, piecing together the story without needing a single word. Clara let go of her husband's hand and stepped forward. Michael did the same. They stopped 3 feet apart. She studied his face, his jawline, his tired eyes, the familiar cleft in his chin. And then, with the smallest breath, she said, "You're real." He nodded, and in that nod, years unraveled. They sat in the quiet room just off the reception hall, an old library lined with dusty books and high windows overlooking the garden where the sounds of laughter and music still floated faintly, as though from another life entirely. And Teresa, now recovered from the faint, rested in a wingback chair while Michael knelt in front of her, not touching her, not speaking at first, simply waiting with his head bowed, as though time itself might offer forgiveness if he remained still long enough. Clara stood a few feet away, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed tightly across her chest, not out of anger, but as if holding herself together. Her wedding dress slightly wrinkled, her eyes locked on the man she had never expected to meet in anything other than the folds of a story or a photograph. And Michael, aware of both of them, aware of how unreal this moment might still feel, finally drew a breath and began to speak, not quickly, not confidently, but with the heavy cadence of someone carrying words for too many years. He told them about the day he left, how he had kissed Clara on the forehead while she slept, how Teresa had packed him a small tin of her lemon shortbread for the voyage, how the Navy had reassigned him suddenly to a covert surveillance mission off the coast of South America, one that was never publicly acknowledged and never officially debriefed, even after the operation fell apart. The ship had gone down, not in flames, not in a dramatic battle, but in silence, during a midnight storm that came too fast and too strong for the aging destroyer to outrun. A mechanical failure, followed by a cascade of panic. Then the sea swallowing everything in less than 20 minutes, leaving no time for protocol, no time for final messages, just salt and darkness and the sound of men disappearing. Michael had been thrown overboard by the force of an explosion near the stern and was knocked unconscious. When he awoke, it was daylight, and he was floating alone in the middle of the Atlantic, his life vest torn, his vision blurry, his lungs full of fear, and for hours he drifted, until a small Brazilian fishing vessel, unaware of any Navy incident, pulled him aboard and brought him to a remote coastal village with no phone lines, no embassy, no urgency. By the time he reached a consulate, weeks had passed, and the paperwork had moved on without him. His name was already carved into a memorial back in Virginia, his file marked "Presumed Dead," his photograph stored away beside medals and flags folded into triangle boxes. And when he explained who he was, what had happened, no one believed him. Not at first, not fully, and by then, he admitted, something inside him had shifted. He said he had planned to come home, tried even, but the idea of re-entering a life that had already mourned him became harder to imagine the closer he got. He spent months moving between cities, between odd jobs and cheap apartments, unable to make the call, unwilling to become a ghost that walked back into the light, only to be feared, or worse, pitied. Teresa listened without interrupting, her fingers intertwined in her lap, her expression unreadable, and Clara sat slowly in the corner armchair, her posture tight, her breathing shallow, as though every sentence from Michael was rearranging the foundation of who she had been taught to be. "I was afraid," he said finally, "not of you, of what I might find, of who I wasn't anymore." There was a long silence. Outside, laughter erupted as someone popped champagne. Inside, everything stood still. Teresa leaned forward then, her voice low and steady, the voice of a woman who had carried her own silence with grace and quiet fury. "I waited," she said, "not because I believed you were alive, but because I didn't know how to stop loving someone who disappeared without saying goodbye." Michael's eyes closed. Clara wiped a tear from her cheek and looked at him directly. "You're not the man in that letter," she said, "but maybe you're still someone I want to know." Michael looked between them, wife, daughter, time lost and time still ahead, and nodded, not in triumph, but in the fragile, trembling way of someone who has been granted not redemption, but the possibility of it. In the days that followed, the air inside Teresa's house, once so quiet it could have been mistaken for an empty museum, took on a new kind of stillness, one not marked by grief or absence, but by cautious presence, by the gentle, uncertain proximity of people trying to remember how to be close again after too many years spent imagining one another in silence. And though the rooms were unchanged, the same lace curtains, the same ticking wall clock, the same framed photo of Clara at age 8 on the mantel, something imperceptible had shifted, like the moment after a storm when the light falls just a little softer through the trees. Michael stayed in the guest room, the one with the narrow twin bed and the quilt Teresa's mother had sewn decades earlier. Every morning he made coffee before dawn, leaving 2 mugs on the counter, one for himself, one for Teresa, though she didn't always come downstairs to drink it with him, and when she did, their conversations were brief, polite, circling around safe subjects like weather or groceries, or how Clara had always loved strawberry jam more than anything else in the fridge. Clara called every day. Sometimes she stopped by, staying for an hour or two, bringing pastries from the bakery down the street or photos from the wedding that had become, whether any of them said it aloud or not, something far more than a wedding. She didn't ask her father many questions, not yet, but she watched him closely, like someone trying to memorize a song they'd only heard in pieces, one note at a time. One evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon in a watercolor wash of pink and indigo, Clara sat across from Michael at the old kitchen table, where the wood had been worn smooth by decades of meals, and spilled coffee and elbows leaned on while stories were told. She placed a small metal box between them, opened it slowly, and began laying out its contents. An old Navy medal, a photograph of Michael in uniform, his wedding ring which Teresa had kept all these years, and the crayon drawing Clara had made as a child of the father she imagined, tall, smiling, hands outstretched, wearing a blue jacket and a red baseball cap. She didn't say anything, just watched him as he touched each item in turn, his fingers lingering on the photo as if trying to reach back through time and hold the man he used to be. Finally, Michael looked up. "I didn't know you kept any of this." Teresa, standing by the sink with her back half turned, spoke without looking. "I couldn't throw them away. That would have meant it was over." Michael nodded slowly, his voice breaking just slightly as he replied, "I didn't think I'd be welcome if I came back. I wasn't sure I deserved it." Clara tilted her head, her voice calm but unflinching. "You didn't come back. You let us grieve you. That's not something you can fix in a week." He didn't defend himself, didn't plead or explain further. He just looked at her, the daughter he'd lost not through death but absence, and said, "I know, but I want to earn whatever you're willing to give me." They sat like that for a long while, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room, until Clara, eyes damp but steady, reached across the table and took his hand, not tightly, not dramatically, but with the soft weight of someone saying, "I'm still here." Later that night, Teresa came downstairs in her slippers and cardigan, finding Michael still awake in the living room, the television silent, a blanket over his knees, and something in his eyes that looked like gratitude mixed with sorrow. She didn't sit down right away. She stood near the bookshelf, tracing her fingers over the spines of novels they once read together, books he'd never finished because duty always interrupted life. And when she finally turned toward him, her voice was quiet but sure. "You know, when you were gone, I kept asking myself whether loving someone who disappears is foolish, or whether it's the only kind of love that matters." Michael looked up, his face open, tired, waiting. She didn't cry. She walked across the room, sat beside him and said, "I don't know if I can ever love you the way I did before." Michael didn't flinch. He whispered, "I wouldn't ask you to." And then she did something neither of them expected. She took his hand, the same one that had written her that letter, and held it between both of hers. Not in forgiveness, not in certainty, but in recognition. The party had thinned by the time Clara found Michael again, standing just outside the barn, beneath a string of lights, swaying gently in the late summer breeze. His hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched, not from the cool air, but from the weight of memory pressing down, a weight that had grown heavier, not lighter, since he'd stepped through those doors and into a life he no longer recognized as his own, but somehow still longed to belong to. She approached slowly, quietly, not because she was uncertain, but because something about the way he stood, still, almost reverent, reminded her of a photograph, something frozen and fragile. And when he turned to see her, there was a softness in his eyes she hadn't noticed before, like the sea after a storm. Inside, the string quartet had resumed playing, an old jazz ballad, familiar, slow, tinged with sadness and sweetness in equal measure. And Clara, with a calmness she hadn't known she possessed, extended her hand. "Would you dance with me?" she asked, her voice steady, not as a question of reconciliation, but as a gesture of invitation, of curiosity, of a door left cracked open just wide enough to let light in. Michael hesitated, not because he didn't want to, but because part of him still feared that any sudden movement might wake him from the dream he hadn't dared imagine for years. But then he took her hand gently and followed her inside, where the music curled around them like smoke, and the wooden floor waited as it had for generations, for feet unsure, for hearts mending. They danced, not gracefully, not with the ease of people who had known one another all their lives, but with a rhythm born of necessity, of something unspoken and urgent and deeply human, an echo of all the moments they hadn't shared, distilled now into one slow turn after another. And though the room fell silent around them as guests stepped back to watch, no one interrupted, because somehow everyone understood that this was not just a dance, but something sacred. Michael's hands were careful. Clara's gaze never left his, and for the first time he felt the weight of what he had missed, not as punishment, but as presence. In the corner, Teresa stood quietly, her arms crossed, her eyes shining not with grief, but with something closer to awe, as if she were witnessing not a miracle, but a truth long delayed and finally spoken, without words, without ceremony, just in the hush of strings and the turn of two bodies daring to remember one another. When the music ended, Clara leaned in, whispered something to her father that no one else heard, and then kissed his cheek. Michael blinked quickly. It was then that Teresa stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, holding in her hand a piece of folded paper so worn it had nearly become cloth. The ink faded, the corners soft, the lines creased and smoothed so many times they no longer held shape. She handed it to him. "This is the letter," she said, her voice quiet, firm. "The one I read every night." He took it with both hands, reverent, the way one might accept an heirloom or a confession. And when he opened it, his own handwriting staring back at him like a ghost, he did not try to speak. Instead, he lowered himself into a nearby chair, unfolded the pages fully, and began to read aloud. His voice cracked on the second line. By the fifth, Teresa sat beside him. By the final sentence, Clara had come to stand behind them both, one hand on each of their shoulders. The letter ended with the words, "I'll always come home to you." And when he finished reading, the silence that followed was not empty but full of everything that had been lost, yes, but also of what had been found. A daughter who still stood, a woman who still listened, and a man who, against all odds, had returned. No one clapped, no one moved, and yet, in that moment, it felt like the world was breathing with them. Later that night, after the final guests had departed and the last candles had burned low, Clara tucked the letter into the inside pocket of Michael's jacket and said, "It belongs with you now." But Michael shook his head, pulled the letter from his chest and placed it back in Teresa's hands. "No," he said, "it always belonged to you." And Teresa, tears silent on her cheeks, folded it once more, not as an ending, but as the beginning of a story they might still have time to tell. In the quiet days that followed, after the music had faded and the wedding flowers had begun to wilt in their vases, the house slowly settled back into itself, not with the emptiness of before, but with a stillness that felt earned, almost sacred, like the pause between verses in a song that has learned to trust silence as much as melody. And it was in that space, between what had been and what could be, that Michael began to write. He didn't write to explain himself or to relive the past, but to leave something behind, not as apology, but as presence. His letter was simple, handwritten in blocky script on thick paper, addressed to no one in particular and to both of them at once. Teresa, who had waited, Clara, who had wondered. He placed it inside a small wooden box lined with velvet, the same one that had held the first letter for over a decade, and he didn't seal it, didn't hide it, only left it open on the table with a note that read, "For whenever you're ready." Teresa kept the box in the living room now, not beside her bed as she once had, not hidden away, but out in the open, next to a photo of Clara dancing with Michael on her wedding night, her dress glowing under the lights, his arms unsure but real. And every so often, when the house was quiet and the afternoon sun came through the windows just right, she would lift the lid and read both letters side by side, not out of habit, not even out of longing, but as a way of remembering what it meant to wait and to be found. Clara took a photograph of that box the next time she visited, printed it, and slid it into the first page of a new family album. She labeled it, in pen, "This is how stories come home." And beneath it, she taped a copy of her childhood drawing, the one with the red hat and the outstretched arms, because even if it wasn't entirely true, it had held a place for him when nothing else had. Michael stayed. Not every day was easy. Some mornings he rose early, sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee, and stared out toward the river, the silence around him full of everything he couldn't change. But he stayed. He learned the rhythms of the house again, the creak of the stairs, the way Teresa left the porch light on, even when she went to bed first, the way Clara's voice softened when she said goodbye on the phone. And slowly, without ceremony, a life resumed. Not the old life, not a perfect life, but something that belonged to all three of them now. A life rebuilt from fragments, from letters, from the spaces between what was broken and what could still be made whole. And sometimes, when Teresa sat alone in the evenings, she would whisper the final line of Michael's first letter, not as a hope, not as a question, but as a truth she now believed. You came home. We publish new stories every day, true stories that move and inspire. If this one touched your heart, leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one.